Welcome to the Civic Brief with Dr. Isaiah Ike Wilson III, where complex issues meet everyday lives. Now, let's begin.
Fellow travelers, welcome back to the Civic Brief. And this being the WiSE Way segment of our Experience 4 focused on force, faith, and the American experience. This WiSE Way, we're going to apply techniques and tools that can range from the battlefields to the boardrooms, if you will, or more importantly, perhaps from our neighborhoods to negotiation tables, those things that we as individuals, as citizens, as businesses, as companies and corporations can employ for first having a better understanding and appreciation of the role, the intersectionality and the role of force and faith in the American experience and everything about that, public, private, governmental, non-governmental, and also techniques that we can employ to be, frankly, better citizens in arriving at that effective balance or equipoise between what St. Augustine called the city of man and the city of God. What I want to do today with the WiSE Way is to talk specifically in terms of force, faith, and what that means for us today and into the future. So again, welcome. Here we take the moral questions explored in the main episode with our guest, Bishop John Stowe, and then we're going to walk them into, again, that strategic, operational, and civic terrain where they actually live in real practical terms. Today, we continue that inquiry, again, into force and faith in the American experience, but with a specific focus on something often misunderstood, and here it is. The uneasy triangle between humanitarianism, development, and state power, and why the United States is now experiencing catastrophic slippage in all three of those arenas. Now, if the main episode asked about faith communities meeting force on the ground, which it did, today we're going to ask what happens when the state completely walks away. What happens when development collapses? What happens when humanitarianism is asked to do the work of government and governance? And what does this mean for America's future, both at home and in the wider world? So let's get clear on terms that Washington often muddies, oftentimes unintentionally, sometimes strategically and intentionally. Humanitarianism. Now, when we say humanitarianism, when we hear humanitarianism, what we're really talking about here is crisis relief. It's immediate, it's neutral, it's life-saving, and it prevents collapse. Development, on the other end of the spectrum, speaks to long-term nation and state shaping. It's slow, it's strategic, it's structural, and it's civic. It prevents crises from occurring. And frankly, when done properly in a preventive defense sort of way, it actually prevents crises from ever manifesting in the first place. Again, humanitarianism, let's think about that in medical relief terms, metaphorically, almost like the tourniquet. So humanitarianism being the tourniquet, then therefore, in that contrast, development is the physical therapy in the rehab, the rehabilitation. They're not substitutes for one another. They are sequential, however, and they are, importantly, interdependent. Now, when you remove development, humanitarianism becomes permanent. And when you remove humanitarianism, crises becomes death. Now, for decades, the United States, through USAID, the Department of State, programs like the Millennium Challenge Corporation, the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, and U.S. International Development Finance Corporation, as well as many others, partner institutions across the board, they've understood this logic. Development was not charity. It was diplomacy, deterrence, and stability. But then came America First 3.0, which attempts to simplify a complex world by, frankly, largely withdrawing from it. The dismantling of USAID is not just a bureaucratic rearrangement. It's the removal of United States' most effective non-military instrument of power. Its absence accelerates global instability, not because America is needed as any kind of savior, but because America's presence historically helped prevent the creation of vacuums. A vacuum that adversaries, now are filling joyfully. Humanitarianism needs are rising. Development pathways are collapsing. Faith institutions are doing their best to absorb the shock of all that. And force is introduced where foresight should have been. Now, what I want to do is I want to take this and I want us to walk a bit and talk through some of today's compound security collisions. I'm going to introduce and talk to a quick 6 of those. First, what we see today is a perfect example of compound dynamics. First, climate shocks that are escalating human insecurity, famine, displacement, resource scarcity. The United States withdrawal from COP 2025, the climate change convention and symposium, signals abandonment at the very moment global coordination is most needed. Secondly, we see migrations pressures surging, not by politics alone, but by pure physics, drought, heat, crop failures. Without development, communities are breaking, and that causes people to move. Thirdly, we see humanitarian systems buckling under all this compound pressure and stress. They're expected to manage flows caused by structural failures that they were never designed to fix. That puts added pressures on state and national public administration systems, making them all the more brittle and ripe for breaking. Fourth, we see faith institutions stepping into that increasing and broadening breach, sheltering migrants, feeding families, stabilizing neighborhoods, but all too often too little too late for not long enough. Not strategically. They're not doing these things strategically. They're not doing them, again, in a sustainable way, but they are doing them with extreme compassion. They're doing it with just compassionateness. 6, state forces, as they do in these circumstances, arriving late, as I said a moment ago, too little, too late, bringing not enough for long enough. They're deploying tools that are increasingly inappropriate for problems born from development collapse. This is where force and faith collide in a very tragic and deleterious way. In the void left when development ceases to exist at all. And friends, fellow travelers, this is our sad, tragic story of 2025. Now, I want to begin to end with some thoughts on foresighting and future roles for particularly for the church in this widening chasm of force and faith. If the United States retreats and continues to retreat from development and climate leadership, then faith communities, local, national, and global, are going to have to shoulder more of the direct burden of human insecurity, throwing off that intended balance, U.S. constitutionally and international constitutionally, frankly, of a balance between church and statehood in more theological and philosophical contexts, that St. Augustinian sense of finding that balance, equipoise between what is the city of man, our life on terra firma, on planet Earth, in this ethereal city of God, right? Imbalances in all things, from the individual human to the most grand geopolitical, are always bad. They always portend bad and ugly things. Now, again, if the United States retreats from development and climate leadership, then these faith communities at all echelons are going to have to shoulder more of that burden. But compassion without development plans, that's going to become exhaustion eventually. And we're seeing some of that already today in real terms. Charity without structural partnership becomes, frankly, futility at an eventual point in time and space. Now, the future, therefore, under these conditions is going to demand what I've talked to you all and talked with you about in the past, what I called, this big term called polycentric partnership. Polycentric just means multi-nodes dispersed over a broad space and time. So polycentric, multi-nodal partner relationships. I want to mention 4 and specifically as I foresee and kind of foresight the evolving role of the church under these compound conditions. First, I think we have to see the church as civic stabilizer. We're seeing it today already, and we're going to see more of it. The church holding communities together as storms, literal, unfortunately, and political, growing stronger. Secondly, we're going to see the church as increasingly that moral circuit breaker, de-escalating tensions where police or military force is the wrong tool for the job. Think about Washington, D.C. Think about Chicago, Illinois, and Portland, Oregon, as well as many other places. Thirdly, we're going to see the church as a foresight partner, helping citizens and policymakers understand what climate displacement, artificial intelligence, demographic shifts, and global inequality mean for our shared futures. And fourthly, we're going to see an increasing role of the church as what I'll call a civic rebuilder, not replacing the state, but helping restore the civic intermediaries that make democratic republicanism resilient. But none of this works if development is abandoned completely and totally. No amount of prayer can replace clean water systems. No amount of volunteerism can replace functioning institutions. Even faith requires infrastructure. So then the moral question is simple. What must we rebuild and who must we become to prevent humanitarianism from becoming the permanent posture of the 21st century? I want to begin the end and close by leaving you, myself and all of us, with a set of questions fit for a republic in this sort of transition. I'm going to give you 7. I'm going to give us 7 to ponder. And maybe we can talk about these as you visit Compound Security Unlocked, the Substack newsletter that companions the Civic Brief. And as we continue our journey together, traveling together through future experiences of the Civic Brief. Here's the first question. What is America's moral obligation in a world where development failures drive human insecurity? Can faith communities remain compassionate without becoming de facto shadow governments? Third question, what replaces USAID's stabilizing function in a world that still needs development? Fourth, what does climate leadership mean when the world's leading democracy refuses to show up at the conferences? Where should force end? And where must foresight begin? That's our 5th question. Question 6. What happens when humanitarianism becomes permanent and development becomes, well, frankly, extinct? And 7th, what kind of nation do we become when compassion is expected, but strategy is withdrawn? Folks, these are the civic questions a mature republic must ask itself and begin to answer together. And these are the questions we'll continue to take up here on the WiSE Way and with the Civic Brief. Thanks for joining me again for Nation Not Self.
Thanks for tuning into the Civic Brief. Got questions, insights, or ideas? Join us at thecivicbrief.com to continue the dialogue. Subscribe, share, and be part of shaping the future, one brief at a time.